Welcome to the IT OT Insider Podcast. David, how are you doing?
Great. How about you, Willem?
It's still recovering from Hannover Messe. It was quite intensive. Lots of noise, lots of people.
Intensive week, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we are back into our normal schedule, our normal super interesting podcasts. And our guest today is Kevin Jones from dataPARC. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, guys. Really happy to be here.
So, as always, Kevin, let's start with a short introduction. What do people need to know about you?
Sure. Well, so I've been with dataPARC now for 26 years and really spent my entire career on industrial data, both from an application standpoint, doing some work with APC and implementing controls using data, and then in the last 20 years really on the data architecture, data management side. So just that's where I've spent my career.
26 years, that's amazing.
So what does dataPARC focus on? What do you guys do besides working with data, which is probably a common theme when you listen to this podcast?
I'd say that's really all we've done, in really looking at the kind of the data management layer, the collect and store of data, the movement of data between systems, and then the analytics layer. That's been our focus from day one, and over the years I've looked at kind of where could we do other things from a business standpoint, but decided to just stay really focused. So we're 150 plus people across the globe that really just work with industrial plants on their data stack.
It's indeed going to be data episodes and historian episodes. I think that's something where I don't know whether that's true, but I have the feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, that in lots of conversations we're having right now, the historian seems to be something which is somewhere, at the beginning of a data architecture. Maybe people don't really see the value. But I'm sure I'm wrong, because my professional life has always been historian focused, first as a data engineer and later with different larger scale installations. What I would like to discuss today, Kevin, is take us a bit through that journey. Like, where did the historian start in the 90s or so? And where are we today?
Yeah, I think even if you look at even the history of dataPARC, we trace our roots back to the early 80s.
Wow.
The founder of the company and kind of our visionary implemented a historian back in like 1981. So it was a homegrown system for what's now Georgia Pacific. And I think his real original idea for it was, well, one, as an engineer, one, data, didn't really have access to a lot of it, but some of it was he felt that when they had their single loop controllers that had the old either strip charts or circular chart recorders, that they kind of had a historian. They had a history of the data. They could go to the file cabinet and pull it out and look at the sheet. And then when they put in their first distributed control system and ripped out all the single loop controllers, that they lost their historian. And so he's like, we actually took a step back in some ways when we got rid of the single loop controllers, and we had this paper record. And so that was really what first drove his idea to let's get a digital record of what we used to have with paper. And so I don't think he was alone in that. And so that kind of, I think in the 80s and 90s, we just needed that digital record. And then, you saw in the 2000s, things kind of evolved, and, and then there was a real, push to either, you go to the cloud or, the data lakes came out. So the thought was, well, the historian's dead. Everything's going to go to the data lake. And, I think for a few reasons, cost, the purpose-built functionality of a historian, didn't quite work out. And then there's kind of open source. Open source is going to, kill all these proprietary historians. And And I think kind of what we're seeing now is that it's like most things, it's not an either or. All of these technologies have a fit. And and the historian, I think, is the foundation of everything we're trying to do. In fact, dataPARC, when we first became a commercial company, when the founders had left the paper mill, decided, let's go do this commercially. It was 2000, and they thought, well, we don't need a historian. We just want to focus on the visualization and the analytics, because everybody's got one. They're already out there, and so we didn't actually develop a historian for 3 years, because we didn't think there was a need for it, and realized pretty quickly that kind of our assumption was wrong there, and there was a need, and still today, I think that exists.
Okay. Now, we're all talking here about historians, assuming everybody knows what makes a historian. So maybe my next question is, Kevin, what makes a historian? What's the core functions that you need to find in a system to say, like, yeah, this is what we call a historian?
Yeah. So I think, when I talk about historian, for sure, we're talking about industrial data. We're specifically talking about the time series pieces of the industrial stack, the sensors that are generating those signals, and then the ability to robustly collect and store very high frequency, up to millisecond frequency data for years of storage. So really that digital record of all the sensor data that you've got in a plant or in an enterprise, in a way that can be accessed quickly and easily by everybody.
And what makes it different? Why can't you just say, like, append the text file until infinity and off we go?
Now I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Yep.
I know Microsoft and the other hyperscalers will probably say, like, yeah, but our data lake, whatever solution, is also perfectly capable in storing massive amounts of data. Well, they do say that. So where is that difference?
So, and certainly, especially the hyperscaler is a great one. They do store huge amounts of data in certain contexts, right? It's with the time series data, there's some very specific architecture nuances to it that allow you to access that data really quickly. It's one thing to have a transaction data. You go to the store, you've got your credit card transaction, and very relational piece of information. That the time series is not really by nature that relational, and so the way you architect the underlying binary historian is kind of unique. And we've done some testing with various hyperscaler systems, and I remember we were in one meeting and a customer was talking about a meeting with one of the hyperscalers, and the hyperscaler was talking about this use case that they were advertising, and hey, we stored 500 values and did all these great things. And in the industrial world, a big fish tank can have 500 data points.
I was going to say that's like half of a machine.
So we're talking it's scale too. Talking thousands, if not up to millions of these signals being stored at very high frequencies. The amount of data you're storing is huge. Gigabytes, terabytes per year, in an architected way that you can then go say, hey, I want to, for my machine one, I've got 1,000 tags. I want to go grab all 1,000 of those tags for a year because I want to do some, machine learning exercise. Well, that's got to come back pretty quickly. And if you don't, think about all those use cases ahead of time, the architecture kind of breaks down.
Yeah, and by the way, also a cost perspective, especially in most cloud systems, and I think people start realizing that. But it's one thing to store something, to write something in your cloud system, but getting all that data back, for example, to calculate, I don't know, weighted averages or something like that, that's actually becoming really quickly very, very expensive. But we are, you talked about the time series part. For those people who've been reading our earlier art, it's I think already 2 years or so ago when we started publishing articles on data platforms, that type of things. And we have this series where first we start with what is data and what is time series data, and you mentioned that. And then I think in the second or the third article, it's like, yeah, but what actually makes the industrial world is the context, the industrial context. Can be your asset structure, can be your production context, but in any case, you want to get data in a certain contextual way. How have you seen? Yeah, how did you see the evolution there? What's changed from the 90s to today, and also how did that change within dataPARC?
I, I'm glad you brought that up because that kind of that industrial context is really important. That was one of the gaps that we saw when we decided to build our first historian, was a really kind of easy way to model the data and provide that context. And so, our first version of the historian we released in 2003 had I'd say it was a very kind of fundamental, basic asset structure where you could easily create process areas and just really organize data from from a catalog standpoint. How do we find it easily? And that's certainly evolved. And I think and in today's world, and I'm sure we'll get into AI at some point, but one of the most important things for any kind of a large language model is to have a really good semantic layer or context layer, so the AI knows where to find data. You talk about determinism, or making your AI, as I call it, just repeatable as possible. And if we can have a good semantic layer, we can be more repeatable, so that the use cases are really prevalent, and it's becoming just as important as ever.
It's a subtle or not so subtle leanway into unified namespace.
Yeah.
I think that's we like on the ITOT Insider, we prefer to talk about contextualization or data management from a more high level perspective,
Maybe more complete. It's
or more
like,
complete.
I mean, in the end, the challenges when you're working with data, there's a lot to learn from the field of data management, and I think we take a lot from that. So it becomes more, how do you manage data, metadata?
But maybe first of all, like UNS in your words, or how you see that.
So I think there's, I guess, kind of the broad definition of UNS, and then I think there's become a very specific, almost branded understanding of it. But broadly, the idea of having we think about a unified namespace, so a universal naming for all of the the sensors and the elements you have in your enterprise is absolutely important. When we talk about the main flow pump to our machine, we want to make sure that every plant has a common definition of that. It's the semantics. We want to make sure we've got a common semantics, so we're talking the same language across the plant. That was really our first goals. We wanted to have this common language that everyone understood. So absolutely important. I think where we sometimes get a little wrapped around the axle of well, do you have the right UNS, the right implementation of this can get a little bit skewed, because you want to make sure you're also solving the problems you have. I think the specific kind of definition and implementation where you've got an MQTT layer on top of all your data get you quite a ways, but you only now have the most instantaneous current value for this UNS.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happens now if you say, well, should I've got a problem with this main flow pump? When did that problem start? Was it just now, or did that start on the night shift? So now you want to go look at your history. Well, now how do you kind of navigate back that? So I think it's, having this universal semantic layer is key, but it should give you the current value. It should be able to then go give you the historical values if you need it to. you want to give it to a machine learning model, you should be able to point that machine learning model at this context layer that can pull in the year of data. So I think it's just a bigger, broader need, but certainly I think we're talking the same thing here, and maybe two sides of the same coin.
I think it at least opened the discussion about, if you would start the discussion on we need a semantic layer, I can imagine most people would say like, oh my God, here's the professor going to give us some speech about some concept I don't need. I think with UNS, it became at least something that...
Tangible?
Yeah, something
For
that
sure.
people said,
Yeah.
I need this. I don't fully grasp all the details, but I do know that I do need to work on something more than just the data values.
Yeah. I've seen it quite a lot where people just, they come to me or whatever, and like they ask like, we need a UNS. And then that it's, well, it can it can mean two things. First, it could mean a brilliant start of a very interesting conversation and a very interesting project. It could also mean that there is a mismatch in expectations.
But a feeling of we need something more than what
Yeah.
we have now, and
Yeah,
that something more is probably connected to whatever we were mentioning before, that semantic layer. Of course, you will need those other things that are not included. You would like to have a graph of the history, yes.
Yeah, but I think it comes back to what are the problems we're trying to solve, and maybe the problem you're trying to solve is just we need to have instantaneous visibility of all of our machines. That's where we're starting from a digital maturity standpoint. And perfect, that great place to start, because that solves that immediate need.
Yeah, no, and so we were not planning to do a recap on Hannover Messe type of podcast, but looking back to last week and comparing that to a year ago, I think one of the changes you can feel, I wouldn't say at each and every booth, but at a lot of those, is that maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, was more about slapping the "we are UNS compliant" or our solution is UNS or build your UNS. And we've seen that, or I don't know if you've seen it changing, Willem, but I've seen that changing in the narrative where people don't start about, oh, but you need this concept. No, we're going to use that as the foundation, as the starting point of the discussion.
I think the understanding in industry is also maturing over the past few years at least, Kevin, I don't know how you're experiencing it, but I'm starting to see people to grasp these concepts at a bit more of a fundamental level, beyond just I need these 5 elements, these 5 technical things, and they will solve my problem.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that is maturing on a few layers, whether it be the UNS topic or the AI topic. That a lot of this is it's plumbing, it's architecture, plumbing, and I feel like as vendors, it's easy to kind of advertise the plumbing sometimes because that's the buzz. But at the end of the day, when you hook all that plumbing up, what problem are we trying to solve? How are we now giving you new places to wash your hands and and a new washroom you can use for the plant? That's what's important is the value that plumbing provides, and kind of moving away from being front and center with some of that just under the covers technology is best for the customer.
Let's move away a bit from the historian as such, and I want to talk a bit more about when are companies ready, maturity. It's also there, and I'm gonna put a link also in the article in the show notes. We also a while ago we published something which we call our data journey model, or data journey maturity model. I'm sure you'll have a couple of interesting stories to share about stuff you encountered. The good, the bad, and the ugly, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the buzz was all digital transformation and the digital journey, and but certainly that's the reality, and every company's on a different path, and even within an enterprise, it's not homogenous, not there's different plants, different business units that are on so a little different path. So we've always looked at companies and tried to kind of categorize them in 5 buckets, just to kind of generally know who they are, where they are, and where we should start. It's really just about giving people a starting point. I think for us, stage 1 was very, very basics, really no automation. So first step for them is they need the automation layer where you can even digitize data. So really where we would start talking with companies is in our stage 2. They're really ready for that first step, and I think we used to see more and more of those companies that were in that stage 2. They're they're tracking things in Excel, and now they're really ready for their first true industrial historian, and having a lot less of those discussions, more in the stage 3 where they at least have had industrial historians and have had starting points, and now they're looking at kind of how can we either look at things enterprise wide or really take the next step in what they're doing. But what hasn't changed, and I think is kind of interesting, is that everybody wants to be stage 5. And everybody and a lot of them they want to go, well, how do we get to stage 5? And so I think kind of that constant for us anyway is education is there's a process here, and you've got to mature technology wise, but also as a company you've got to mature. It's not just the technology. You have to know how to use it to get the value from it also.
How is that people aspects? You need to mature. What does that mean in practice? Like from 3 to 5, let's say, where's the difference?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One is it's I'd say starting at I think the foundation of the plant floor, having a culture where where you're empowering people to make decisions, versus just being straight. We're SOP driven. This is how we operate. Versus, hey, we're going to operate based on the data. You have to have that empowerment and that willing in the organization. And then I think you also have to have now we go all the way to the top level of an understanding that we have to be data driven, and using that data to make decisions. So it's I think moving the company in that way to believe the data, use the data, and that's how we make those decisions, and that's an evolution.
Yeah, and there is the really important part of taking those operators on the journey, and it's actually really interesting, because many of them, like, first thing they do when they enter a plant is put away their iPhone or Android phone or whatever, and then and then step back to using something where I go like, yeah. But on the other hand, there is also a large portion of the operators who've never really been never really been introduced in those new technologies, because when they started working at the company, things were pneumatic or manual, so it's important to take them into that journey.
Yeah, and kind of and making them part of it, not just kind of being told here's what you're going to do, but getting their buy-in. Because I think having buy-in is really important. One of the things that I look at, like, kind of 3 characteristics of a successful organization to be at that stage 5, and it's kind of the team, it's the trust, and then it's the technology. So you kind of have to have those 3 T's to really get to that stage 5 in a real kind of, like, a successful way.
In our conversation we had before we started the podcast, you shared something about a black paper on a screen, and I love that story. I think you should share it with the audience as well.
Yeah. So, I would say, in kind of our first 10 years as a company, and I talked a little bit about kind of the original vision of replacing the strip chart recorders and the paper recorders. So Ron Baldus, our founder, really believed in getting the operators involved. That's he always said that's where the money's made. They're the ones making the decisions 24/7, 365 days a year. So we always really loved it when we'd hear from a customer, hey, there was an issue with the system. The shift operator overnight, called up the OT on call guy, woke him up in the middle of the night, and made him, come fix the problem, because they're like, this means they live by it, right? If there's an issue and they don't call, that's not good. So when we hear these stories, we're like, unfortunate there was an issue for whatever it was, but we're just really glad that we have that buy-in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one of my favorite examples of this was at a plant in the southeast part of the U.S., and they had a couple of monitors that were in the control room. They were kind of these little kind of mini box trends with 3 or 4 tags each. So it's like a 4x4, so like 16 box trends. And the on-call person got woke up in the middle of the night, and the operator said, "Hey, not working," and then he said, "Well, what's not working?" He said, "Well, normally there's 16 trends up here, but I only see 8 of them." And he's like, how can that be? I must be mishearing this. Well, try rebooting, because set up it automatically come back up. And
always step one.
Yeah, step one, right? Especially at 2 a.m.
Yeah. We had our fair share of those calls, David.
Oh, yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. Standard procedure, turn it off and on again.
And that didn't fix it. So, the guy's like, all right, I've got to drive in. So, got his pickup, and 20 minutes later walked in the control room. And what he found was that the person before him had taken a piece of black paper and really eloquently cut out 8 squares of the 8 trends he wanted to see, because and we it is a pattern recognition part to this, and this guy felt like these were the only 8 ones he needed to see, so he'd really nicely taped a black piece of paper over the monitor with cutouts for 8 of the trends that he wanted to see, and hid the other ones. And so the shift guy, sometime we'll have to get this guy on the call. He actually works for us now, and he's a character. So I just picture him walking in, this big personality, and he sees it, and he just grabs the corner of the paper, rips it off the screen, and he said, "I just threw it on the floor and walked out. Didn't say anything."
Yeah, as Willem said, we also have our fair share of stories to tell, but this.
Yeah.
I've never.
I also don't know if I would be very amused sitting there at 3 o'clock in the morning, half awake, seeing paper.
Just a piece of paper taped on the screen. There's the technology, is working as it's supposed to. So that was a good story, but it also, I guess, reinforced to us, we really enjoyed hearing the story. And of course, the fact that I wasn't there and having to be the one to wake up and do it, it was really funny to me. But the idea that this operator felt like he was flying blind, needed the data to be running a pretty complex unit operation, enough that he give the guy a call at 3 a.m.
It's a simple example, but there are so many variants on that example. And one of the variants is, no, you don't want an operator to use their personal password and change every time the shift changes or whatever. You just want them to be like, enter the control room, sit down, and see whatever they need to see. Like you wanna put that threshold as low as possible.
I do like those stories though, because it's also showing this person that put that paper on, they did that with great care. They knew, I only want to see this data and not the other data. It wasn't just some random pattern. It wasn't, I don't want to see anything. So it's also uncovering a difference. One guy needed it. The other said, I don't need it.
And I don't remember the details, but I would hope that also led to a discussion with the person who put the paper up there, like, hey, why did you think you only needed to see these 30 variables, not the other 20? What do because these people working in the plants, they know these processes really well, and if we don't take advantage of that knowledge and use that as a feedback into the system we build, we're missing an opportunity. We've got a lot of AI running around our plants. It's in the heads of our people, so it's a good opportunity to get that feedback.
Now, and we know that some of our listeners are, of course, working on tech and data systems. We also have people who work in plants and just work more on the field. And very often they see technology as a solution. But like you said, also that organizational part is important. Now, if you're, well, maybe first question, who are like key people you need to get on board in a plant, in a manufacturing site, to make that transition happen?
Well, I think there's at least three roles that you have to have on board. I mean, you need an executive sponsor who can sign the check. I mean, that's just the reality. And then you need an operations manager, kind of who oversees the operations, to be on board, because that's where the change is going to start on the day-to-day operations. And then you need some technology person to help with the implementation, and make sure that all the technology is in place. So at least those three, and I think and then the fourth, that plant floor, some willing operators to get that buy-in, and I think that goes hand in hand with the operations management. So I think at least those three, and I think also a willingness to start small, to get the quick win, because that's where that trust part of the equation comes into play. Because if we can get some wins, advertise it, I think that just it snowballs. I look at one of our most successful customers and largest by tag count. One of the things they did was actually put in as part of the dataPARC system, they put in a way to track their successes. So just like you would track a production event, or you would track something in the process, they track their successes with the data. And I mean, it was kind of a marketing tool, but it also really helped like spread the buy-in, and both at the top level, because they could justify really easily. There's a report you could pull up of the successes, and kind of a knowledge sharing across the plant floor. That was a really great idea, because it just helped build that trust and reinforced it quickly.
Absolutely. Marketing, internal marketing, is
yes.
so underestimated. It's extremely important, because even if within your plant it's a success, you still want to export the success to the other plants in the company, or it's so important.
It's still a word that many engineers don't like. Marketing feels like
right.
It's not in our genes to go and make publicity and work.
We want to just tell us the problem, we're going to solve it, and then we'll walk on to the next problem. And I get it. It's in my DNA too. But just, where we've seen the successes of that, just really just sharing the successes, and it's really just a transparency thing, which I think as engineers, we can get behind that part of it, that we're really just providing more transparency and providing information.
Absolutely. Talking about marketing, like, you have all these hats behind you. Is that like a personal hobby to collect as many hats
for people
as possible?
listening? David means baseball caps.
Baseball
There's
caps.
not a human heads sitting behind Kevin.
Yes, we might want to redo this take, but I'm not gonna. I'm not
Baseball
gonna
caps.
do that. Baseball caps. Thank you, Willem.
Yeah. So these are all team baseball hats from youth sports. So I've one of my side hobbies is coaching youth baseball.
Wow.
And so these are all teams of my my boys that I've coached over the years. So every year I put the team hat on the wall, and have gained quite a collection.
Oh, that's amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Super cool. Hey, time flies when you're having fun, as always. I think we still have a lot of other things we can discuss, and why don't we do that in a later episode? But for now, Kevin, thank you very much for donating your time and your knowledge to us.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. I really enjoyed it. This was a fun conversation, and I feel like there was lots of topics we could have unpacked some more. So let's do it
I
again.
think there's a couple. I'm pretty
Absolutely.
sure.
Also, big thank you to dataPARC for sponsoring this episode. And as always, if you like our work, you can find us at itotinsider.com, itot.academy, and also now on itotbook.com, because we have a book coming out really soon, and it's all about organizational and change stuff as well. So Kevin, I'm
And
sure you're gonna like
data
that as well.
semantics and stuff like that.
All right. Thank you very much, Willem, Kevin. And until we meet again, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.